A warning to all about to listen to this podcast. The following audio may contain spoilers and inappropriate language, but most importantly, this podcast will definitely contain some bad opinions. You have been warned, but for now, let's get on with the show.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Ego Without Amigos, part of the Anime Abroad podcast here on YouTube and elsewhere. Okay, this time we'll be continuing from last time our discussion of a few shows from this season, just a few first impressions covering the following shows: Terra Formars, Trinity Seven, Garo, Donten Ni Warau, Gugure Kokkuri-San, Ookami Shoujo to Kuro Ouji, Shingeki no Bahamut, Genesis. I'm sure I butchered a few of those names right there, and there were probably English names for them too, so that's inexcusable. Let's carry on. I'm going to try to change it up a little bit this time, add a few plot details to my analysis. Make sure you actually know what the show is about before you listen to me ramble on about it for a little bit. So let's get started. Terra Formars. I'm not going to go into too many details on this show's plot because I'm not even sure of that myself. For some reason, the main thing is that humans sent cockroaches and mold to Mars years in the past. Now they're sending a small human crew to investigate and to recover from the complete mess that they made. The Mars is apparently swarming with cockroaches and mold. So, is it hospitable? Apparently that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to accomplish a little bit of terraforming, but that went horribly wrong. So the protagonist was chosen because he possesses some sort of ability, which makes him a lot stronger, and he can survive on Mars. The rest of the crew, I'm not particularly sure why. You will know right away why the protagonist was chosen as in a few minutes into the show, but for the rest of them, you won't really know until later, I'm guessing. The animation for the show is okay. It's nothing too special. Art style is a little too gritty for my taste. The face shape, the noses, a little too JoJo-esque for me. Muscles and overall bulk of people, too emphasized, too defined. It gets kind of unnerving. You watch a show like this and watch shows like Rainbow, which are way too dark, overbearing, literally edgy, and emphasize eyebrows and muscles and muscular men. And it gets unnerving. I almost sound insecure here. It's just strange. You have to acquire a taste for this kind of animation, this art style. The plot, I mean, you know what as much as I know. It seems a bit confusing. It's overall fairly understandable, but who knows? We'll see what happens to the characters, to the protagonist, what even led up to this, to his special ability. The characters that we've seen so far in this first episode, or that I've seen so far, you'll find out, they don't seem likable at all. The protagonist, maybe, but his backstory is also fairly convoluted. There's not much you can see him developing from it. You see his, spoilers here, but I think it's since it's in the first episode, it won't really matter. You see how his girlfriend or significant other was killed so that he would fight in these underground gladiatorial rings. There's no real promise for his development as a character, so we'll have to wait and see if that actually changes. The motivation for the goal in the show is that it's for the good of humanity. It's a bit impersonal. I mean, sure, you have the protagonist's girlfriend die from apparently some disease that was contracted from Mars, but that's still unclear. The motivation is really not all that there. It's an interesting premise. The reasons behind the premise aren't so clear or explained. They could use clarification, and exposition would actually help the show. So, to sum it up, this is a show for those looking for out of the ordinary plot, grittiness, and mild action. Moving on to the next show, we are going to be talking about Trinity Seven. The plot details are simple enough. This guy has a magic book called a grimoire that lets him do magic, and so he decides to go to magic school. He's faced with the options of forget everything or die, but he chooses the third option, go to magic school. There, he has to be careful to watch out for the 7 bosses of the school, the girls strongest in their specific category of magic. The principal of the school straight up says that these are 7 boss-like figures, as if in a video game. Thoughts on the OP? It kicks ass. Not something I'd go out of my way to listen to, but it's certainly drawing me into the show. The animation and art style is somewhat reminiscent of Madoka. You don't really see all that much of the similarity, but there's a few things that kind of remind you of it. There's magical girls, for one. They all have specific powers, and they all carry big weapons. Or at least the one we saw so far carried a big weapon. You could talk about the psychological implications of this, the penis envy thing, but we won't go into that. So the show has a good concept to deliver on the rest of it, but it might be too cliche, it might be too, episodic, it might be too boring to repeat this process over and over with each of the 7 characters. But just like in a video game, there's always different ways that you can approach a boss. There's always different things that a boss can do. There's always differences in the boss themselves. So we'll have to see how the bosses react, how the protagonist reacts to the bosses. We already see some interaction, and we actually see some characters that are bosses displaying unboss-like features. So hopefully we can find out if the show is less cliche than it seems to be. One interesting thing I noticed was that the arts of the bedroom fall under the magic arts. That's something to note, and this show is somewhat lewd, so you'll have to be careful of that. This is a show for people who like harems. 7 boss characters who are all female, who are all strong at magic, and a protagonist who is male. Nothing suggests anything out of the ordinary for a harem. There's comedy, there's lewdness. It's a typical harem show in many regards. Next on our list is Garo. I'll tell you what I know of the plot so far, just from the first episode. 1. Witches are actually good. They fight demons. 2. The knights protect them, and also fight the demons. So the show starts off with a pregnant witch being burnt at the stake by the king's witch hunter advisor. I think he'll play a bigger role later. It's not exactly clear that he's a witch hunter, but it's very subtly hinted at. So while she's being burnt at the stake, the witch has the baby, and then a knight from the dungeons actually comes to rescue the baby. Why he left the witch to burn, that remains unanswered. But overall, that's how it happened. So then the story fast forwards 17 or so years, and the duo are now hunting demons and fending off the witch hunters. By fending off, it mostly just means running. First thing I notice from the show is how annoying the voice actors are. Wow, come on. This king and his advisor are a couple of the most pretentious voice actors I've ever heard in Japanese. They have the very stereotypical, royalty voices, but extended far beyond that. Archer warned me. I should have listened. There's a goddamn CG knight on his stupid CG horse.
Fucking told ya.
The animation in this show for the OP, the animation and the song are both weird, and I don't particularly like it. I actually almost stopped watching the show right then and there. I delayed watching it because I didn't like the OP, but I kept going. and I don't think it was, I don't regret it. Still, the art style is a bit iffy, very gritty, somewhat off-putting, and the bits of CG hardly improve on that. On the contrary, they might make it worse. I've heard opinions that say the CG is nice, that it's one of the best uses of CG, best implementations of CG in anime right now, but personally I don't particularly like it. The plot, it's well grounded. Simple, but not so overly simple, and it's far from falling into the trap of an overly complicated fantasy, which is something that you often want to avoid. There's plenty of action. At first, this show seemed like it might be an episodic Monster of the Week style show, but hopefully the main focus of the show prevails without too much cliche, and the ending is actually a bit suggestive of a strong overall plot, which is pretty promising. The action's well done, slow motion and awkward time lapses are a bit shaky in the animation during it, but overall it's well done. It seems likely to be most watched anime of the season in the shonen age group, even though it's not a shonen show. It's classified as adult, and you can tell that by the sex scene that occurs, but it seems something that would fit into shonen tastes very well, the art style wise and action wise. So this show is for someone who is looking for action and visuals, though its visuals aren't going to appeal to everyone. The plot may develop, but right now it seems a bit up in the air. Next up, we have one of the shows that I was actually looking forward to watching this season, Donten Ni Warau, or Warau. I don't know how to pronounce it. So the synopsis for this show is that following the Meiji Restoration, Westernization is occurring rapidly in Japan, and a ban on samurai has occurred. If you know Japanese history, you know this is accurate. You know that this is actually what happened. Donten Ni Warau is kind of a microcosm of this. It follows the three Kumo brothers as they help to transport the increased number of criminals to a prison. So, first things first, the character design looks a bit shonen at first. A bit too shonen with the red-tipped hair and the general hairstyles. I don't particularly mind this, but it might be off-putting for some people. I expected a bit more seriousness from this show, judging strictly from the plot synopsis, but the humor aspect surprised me. This much humor isn't actually necessarily bad for a show, but I don't know if it's good for it either, because it has to be consistently like this, or it will actually disappoint and lose viewers. This show has a lot of plot points going for it right off the bat, starting with the backstory of the brothers, moving on to the present day, and an alluded future plot point at the end of the episode. It certainly got its fair share of promise. One thing that really struck me was the character interaction and development that happens only this far into the show. One episode in, and we have sibling relationships, dialogue to establish them, dialogue for us to judge the relationships for ourselves, and we have the middle brother's emotions coming through at the end, and his interaction with his older brother is something to see. For that interaction alone, I think it's worth watching the first episode, but we'll have to see if it actually follows through on that later. It might not, particularly keep up to the standard, but fingers crossed. So I'm looking forward to watching this, but I honestly don't know what to expect. Hopefully the plot falls through, hopefully the characters keep up what they are, and don't fall into generic categories. So this is a show that I would say is for people looking for a bit of action, quite a bit of comedy, and a possibly decent plot. Might be episodic, unfortunately, but overall seems to be well grounded. I can recommend this show so far. So at this point I was actually going to talk about Log Horizon 2, but I'm not going to share my thoughts on that just yet. You'll have to watch the Anime Abroad podcast for that. And for those of you who wanted to know about Log Horizon 2, you probably know about Log Horizon 1. So the next show I'll be covering will be Gugure Kokkuri-San. So the plot point of this show, you can tell within the first couple minutes, is a doll summons a demon to play with her, but doesn't actually want him around. And the demon is hardly anything special. So the show just circles around their interactions and what they do with each other. 5 minutes in, and I already know what kind of show this is. It's a cutesy comedy. That said, it's pretty funny so far. The doll calls the cops on him after he wanted to take a shower with her. 10 out of 10. You summoned me. Why don't you ask me a question? It would be quicker to use Google. 11 out of 10. She finally asks him for tomorrow's weather. He Googles it. 12 out of 10. This is just a few little things that happen that make me laugh throughout the episode. And I think it's good for someone who's willing to ignore a little bit of the cutesiness, or is actually looking for the cutesiness, and is actually looking for some decent humor. The show is quick with the wit. It has an interesting, somewhat original setup for the rest of the plot. If there even is a plot, it might be episodic. And it possesses strong storytelling and emotion-grabbing element. I mean, at the end of the episode, you feel emotions that you honestly probably didn't expect to feel. So, I mean, it's good. I like it so far. This is the kind of show to watch if you're looking to laugh, if you're into cutesy things, if you're not bothered by some adult humor and some Japanese cultural references. And if you're actually looking for those things, this is the show for you. Moving on to Ookami Shoujo to Kuro Ouji. This show is about a girl who wants friends in high school. Sounds very, very generic when I read just that bit. Moving on, she lies and says she has a kinky boyfriend, but of course she's really a virgin. When she takes a picture of a random guy to show to her friends, it turns out the guy is in their school. So, after a little bit of awkward confrontation, he agrees to be her boyfriend at a price. We'll start off at the OP. The animation is fine. It's very nice and mellow. But the music is actually, in contrast to this, and pretty exciting. And I like it. I like the combination. I like the contrast. I like the music. Just as the synopsis said, this girl is the queen of awkward. The setup for the main plot is amazing. The build-up and the climax really make it seem like much more than I picked this guy, he agreed, and then we fell in love story. Which it probably is in the long run, but right now it's gradual and it's working out well. And suddenly, Sata Kyoya is the best character. I really like this part of the show where she tells him what she did and he agrees to be her pretend boyfriend. So right before the commercial, he tells her something with a specific facial expression, but following the commercial break, it cuts to him saying the same line, but they change the shadowing on his face, they change the facial features themselves, and they change the tone of the voice that he actually says it with. This is some creative stuff. I really like it. This really impressed me, and I can't emphasize that enough. His facial expressions kill me throughout this show, and they work perfectly. If there's anything to watch this show for, it's Sata Kyoya. I want to keep watching this show just to see this dynamic develop. So this show is for someone who's looking for comedy, slice of life, and probably a bit of a romance. Honestly, I think it's worth it just for the facial expressions and to see a bit of the characters themselves, but that's entirely left up to you. And the last show I'll be covering on this podcast will be Shingeki no Bahamut Genesis. So this show is about a fantasy world in which a bounty hunter goes around fighting criminals that use monsters, and he collects the bounties on them. One day he meets a girl who wants to follow him to a place he was bragging about going to. First things first, the opening scene is exciting and compelling. It conveys zero sense of what's going on, but something huge, something epic, for lack of a better word. It's a giant battle with dragons and fire and spells and all sorts of things, and I have no idea what's going on. The music stands out. I'm not quite sure how to feel about it, but it stands out. It might be good, it might be bad. It really depends on the scene, and I was a bit iffy on it, but it's also pretty relevant to the show sometimes. The character design is a bit ugly. It's a bit overly eccentric, and it actually fails to match the voice actors very well. The protagonist, Favreau, is actually one of the ugliest characters that's in the show, but for some reason he's the protagonist. I don't know what the creator saw in curly redheads that have giant puckering lips, but it's not my cup of tea. Plus, nothing against curly redheads, but I don't know, it just didn't work. The animation doesn't really fit him, the art style doesn't really fit him, he seems out of place, his voice just doesn't suit him, it seems kind of whiny. The animation is amazingly well done though, so that's something. There's one scene in particular that really stood out to me. That was the scene in which a horse pulls the bandits' carriage, and that horse flees. It's actually a couple of horses, and they flee, and this is a scene that, doesn't really have any relevance to the overall plot. It's not a huge scene or anything, and yet the animation is stunning. It really works really well, and I like that. The action scenes are pretty nice. The animation really seems full-fledged, well done. It works, and it's a pretty show. The minor plot details are actually carefully addressed, not just ignored. Something about the show that strongly pushes for an overarching and impending plotline. What I mean by this is this show doesn't just ignore its little tiny details. It focuses on the big picture, but it really just captures all those little things. You watch shows like, off the top of my head, Trigun, where, not everything is explained. The manga is very, very specific about a lot of different characters, but you see a little bit of those specific characters when you watch the show. You have to watch it carefully to pick up on it, but on close inspection of the girl's outfit, when she meets Favreau, suggests such a thing. It's not addressed outright, but if you look carefully, you'll know exactly where she got those clothes. As for the girl herself, and her, something else about her, you'll find out. She has the best character design in the show. Hands down. Everyone else looks pretty ugly. The show is... wrapping it up, the show is for someone who's looking for a fully fantastical world. It has action, it has good visuals, the mediocre character design is negligible when you consider some of the good character design, like the girl. And the plot is pretty promising. So, look out for this show. I seriously recommend it. Alright, that wraps it up for this episode of Ego Without Amigos. Thanks all for listening. Be sure to check us out. See ya.